A good roadmap will get you to your destination. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is Budget 2023. To discuss all this and more, we've invited two guests to our studios this evening as well. Joining us this evening on the show are Daniel Alphonsus, former advisor to the Ministry of Finance, as well as Chayu Damsingha, economist. Tonight on the show, you can also send us your SMSs to 0766 565353. I would be more than delighted to take your questions to the panelists today on Face the Nation as usual. Let's get the ball rolling with Daniel Alphonsus, former advisor to the Ministry of Finance. Before talking about Budget 2023, Daniel, let's talk about what exactly is a budget.
So the budget is a piece of legislation that authorizes the government to raise revenue, in other words, to tax, and also authorizes the government to spend money. In addition, the practice has become that the budget speech is the major statement of government economic policy for a given year and sets the roadmap for the government's policies going forward. In this case, it will be the first proper budget presented by the new president and will set the framework presumably for the rest of his administration as well.
When you take a look at the budget over the last few years, the last few decades, despite a budget being imposed, there are several revisions that are brought forward in Parliament throughout the last few years. What is the reason behind this? Now, you say this is the economic policy framework for that particular year in question as far as the government is concerned, but we see revisions being made subsequently throughout that particular year in question. What is the reason behind this, Daniel?
So I think there's three factors that come immediately to mind. The first is the fact that there isn't a robust system of checks and balances in our political system. We have a political system where the executive is dominant, and therefore the executive, when it feels like, can change the framework within which it's operating, in other words, the budget, with relative ease. It can pass supplementary votes and so on and so forth quite easily without much pushback from other institutions such as the legislature. Secondly, the quality of economic policy making leaves much to be desired relative to some of our competitors or partners. The level of technical expertise involved in the budget drafting process is relatively limited, and the process itself can often be quite rushed. So there's a technical aspect to it as well. And then the third aspect has been the fact that events have often meant that budgets have gotten affected. So for example, in 2018, during the constitutional coup, the budget was unable to be presented, and then there was interim budgets, votes on account, so on and so forth. The same took place during COVID. So I think that's a third factor that has led to the lack of stability in policy making. But in addition to all of this, I think what's important to remember is that budget proposals or the appropriation bill has not acted as an effective method for allocating expenditure, as in the allocations bear very little resemblance to reality, partly because there is a lack of accountability in our entire society. The fact that not only do institutions within government, such as the legislature, not hold the executive to account, more generally, I think there's a lack of accountability arising through public reasoning institutions like the media as well.
The first reading of the budget on the 14th of November this year will be very, very crucial for the government in play. Why? Because now there's discussions about debt restructuring, there's discussions about the IMF tranche, there's discussions about moving forward in the next financial year, so on and so forth. How important is it for the government to consider all these aspects going forward as far as the 14th November budget speech is concerned?
I think the budget speech is going to be crucial, as I mentioned, for setting the framework for the current administration's policy making going forward. And there, I think the focus really should be on carrying the public along with the very difficult reforms that need to take place. Sri Lanka, as we've discussed on this program before, has essentially stalled its reform program since 2004 or 5. and in many ways reversed it since then, before the last year. So there has to be a complete 180-degree turn in terms of the momentum of the transformation of the economy. And that's difficult. We have already seen the tax increases and the burden they place on the public. So there's going to be a number of other difficult reforms that the government is going to have to take place. And the budget speech is, in my view, the right place to begin the process of carrying the public along that program and explaining to them how we got here, what needs to be done, who's going to bear the pain of this, why that pain needs to be borne, and why at the end of the day it's going to put us on a better foundation and get us out of this mess.
Daniel, how fair is it to put the burden on the public when it's sheer mismanagement by respective governments in play that has led to this crisis at this very moment of time? Is it fair to put the burden on the public?
It's certainly not fair. However, there's no alternative at the current moment other than raising revenue, optimizing expenditure, and doing the structural reform needed to unlock growth. So I think there's two things we can talk about in terms of pain. The first is who bears the pain within the public. The second is how do we minimize the level of pain involved. And I'm sure over the course of the show we'll discuss those 2 points.
When we speak about raising revenue, reducing expenditure is also key, isn't it?
So if you look at Sri Lanka, our tax to GDP ratio is one of the lowest in the world. That also means that our expenditure, government expenditure as a share of GDP, is also much lower than our peers. So in other words, what we have is a problem of being a low tax, low spend economy. That is not to say that there is a huge amount of optimization and reallocation that needs to take place within government expenditure, because a huge amount of government expenditure is either wasteful or inefficient.
Daniel, interestingly, you speak about reducing expenditure and also raising government revenue, but I want to drag your attention to the appropriation bill that was tabled in Parliament several days ago with regard to the 2023 budget in question. The revenue, the expenditure stands at 7.8 trillion for the year 2023. In 2022, the government expenditure stood at 6.1 trillion only. So there is a steep increase of approximately 1.7 trillion in this respect. Is that fair?
So the reason, if you look at our government's budget, I believe over 80% of it, Chayu, correct me if I'm wrong, is recurrent expenditure, the vast majority of which is either interest payments or salaries, which the government has very little discretion in changing. And with the inflation levels that exist at the moment, that number will keep increasing. The question is the government allocating its money efficiently, or is it allocating it wastefully? At this particular juncture, when there is so much suffering and pain going around, that question becomes all the more acute. And what I would argue is that the major problem facing the government is that it employs too many people. It employs too many people doing jobs that are unproductive or with limited productivity, where those individuals could play a much more productive role in the private sector or elsewhere. So if we look, for example, at the public service, it took nearly 40 years for the public service to double between 1960 and 2005. Then between 2005 and 2015, the public service nearly doubled in size again, despite the population not growing very much. The vast majority of this was basically people recruited through lists rather than through exams or other forms of merit. From every bit of evidence we have available, we know that the jobs that they're doing in the public service are not necessarily particularly productive. This is primarily a form of patronage and welfare, or a very poorly designed welfare system. We see the same case with the military. The war ended. However, the military has not reduced in size. Unlike almost every country in the world, where about 40% of the military are in reserves, allowing them to contribute to the economy, in Sri Lanka, we have no reserves. Military expenditure today is higher as a share of GDP than even some points during the war. So there's very serious questions that need to be asked about where the government is spending its money. The question is less, should it spend less, but where is it spending it?
But if you look at it based on the appropriation bill that was tabled in Parliament several days ago, Daniel. Defense expenditure stands at 410 billion, which is more than the health sector, which is 322 billion, the education sector, which stands at 232 billion, and public security standing at 129 billion. So if you look at the defense expenditure alone, as you correctly mentioned, is quite steep at the moment.
Yes, it's really absurd. This is something that should have been done 10 years ago. Hopefully it will be done now. And the only way I can see that happening quite quickly is to transfer active duty personnel into the reserves, which will immediately reduce the wage bill and the upkeep cost of the government, because you have to pay for their food, uniforms, accommodation, so on and so forth. So the total wage bill for an active duty soldier is considerably higher than a reservist. It'll immediately reduce that. In addition, it'll free up labor to contribute to the economy in terms of productive economic activity. The members in the reserves can join the private sector and perform the role that they need to perform. So at the very least, I think in this government, in this budget, the government should commit to a reserve target of 40% within 2 years.
The appropriation bill alone does not articulate the government's policy framework for the year 2023. Do you think the government must pay its attention to reduce expenditure at least in the next few days, next few months, and make sure that the government revenue is on par with the government expenditure that we're talking about?
So as I mentioned, I don't think it's the level of expenditure that is the problem. It is where it is allocated. That money can be used, for example, for targeted social transfers. In other words, welfare payments to those who need the money. That would still be a form of expenditure and it would help ease some of the pain. But in order to make that cash available, the government will have to reduce its headcount. We just discussed the military. The other way, I think, would be to identify all those who have been recruited to the government outside an exam system, or conduct an exam and ensure that those who do not pass such an exam are forced within a certain period of time to leave the government system.
Then I'll speak about the nitty-gritties of the appropriation bill momentarily, but I just want to drag your attention to the public administration expenditure, which stands at 856 billion, out of which 353 billion alone will be allocated to pay pensions for the state sector employees. How important is it to retrench the state sector employees?
So that's precisely what we were just discussing. I think it's very important, especially those who have been selected outside a process of merit and where the functions they are performing are not necessarily productive. With respect to pensions, I think the pensions bill has reduced it in real terms because of inflation. However, going forward, we certainly need to move towards a contributory pension scheme. The current structure of pensions in this country is not sustainable. And this has been something that has been on the table for over 20-something years.
Right. So before we move on to Shahid Amsingha, we'll go for a quick short commercial break. And when we come back, we discuss more on Budget 2023.
නැගිටින වෙලාවෙ කියා දෙන ජීවන කලාව.
මානසික ආර්ථික තත්ත්වයකදී
මට කලින් වෙන කෙනෙක් ඉස්සර වුණා. ඉස්සරහට ඇවිල්ලා කියන්න මමයි මේ වැරද්ද කරේ කියන්න.
දැන් පොරට යම් බලපෑමක් කරනවද කියන එක තමයි මට තියෙන සැකය.
බරපතල චෝදනාවක් තියෙනවා. අයිදුම් පත්‍රය බාර දුන්නාට පස්සේ යම් කාල සීමාවක් රැඳී සිටිනවා.
ජලය හුරුලුවට ලැබිලා තියෙනවා.
මේ හොඳ දැනුමක් කිරීපක් ගලේ බවට පත් වෙනවා. මේක ඉතාමත් පැහැදිලිව කිව යුතුයි.
නැගිටිමු ශ්‍රී ලංකා. හැමදේම කියන හැමදාම. උදෑසන 7 සිට. පැතිකඩ නිදහස්ව ඇහැරෙන්න අදහස්.
ස්වයං විවේචනාත්මකව තමන්ම ඉදිරිපත් වෙන රයිට් මම මෙතනින් අයින් වෙනවා මම ද්විත්ව පුරවැසි.
ශාරීරික හිංසනය, ලිංගික හිංසනය පහුගිය වකවානු වල වෙච්ච තරම් ඒ විදිහට වෙලා නැහැ.
හිතන විදිහ වෙනස් කරන එක තමයි මූලිකවම කරන්න වෙන්නේ. මොකද මේ ප්‍රශ්නේදී මොකද ප්‍රශ්නේ තියෙනවා කියන එක ඒක ස්ථිරයි.
සබ්බේ බායන්ති මච්චුනෝ මොම දඬුවමට බයයි. දැන් දඬුවමට බය නිසා අපරාධයක් කිරීම වළක්වනවා. ඒක අපරාධ නීතියත් එක්ක සිද්ධාන්තයක්.
ජාතික මෙහෙවර සතියේ දිනවල උදෑසන 10:00ට TV1 ඔස්සේ.
ගමට සතුට ගෙන එන ගම්මැද්ද රට නගන ජනපෞර.
One more integrated.
So I think there is no question.
They ought to have reversed it.
A bit of window dressing.
Forgotten about disasters that have been introduced. Now those are the same people who were laughing at.
Today's topic is of very high.
We have been importing more than we are exporting.
The tax measures in isolation and
a reflection of good governance.
An important word.
Newsline weekdays at 8:30 p.m. on TV1. ලක්ෂ 220ක ජනතාවටම ප්‍රවෘත්ති කියන 20000 බලකායට එක්වන්න.
News First, you report.
ඔබ දුටු දේ ඔබම කියන්න. ලියාපදිංචියට 0770යි 73යි 15යි 19ට ඔබේ නම WhatsApp කරන්න.
People's mindsets are strong. Despite poverty, they are strong enough to stand up and be counted. For them, Gammadda has been a source of strength for over a decade. Gammadda, for the people, by the people.
Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. Joining me this evening is also Vishal Kapuge on to my immediate right. I'm only flanked with one journalist today. Let me just quickly pose a question to Chayud Amsingh. Chayud, in your opinion, how do you view a budget?
So I think when we look at how the budget is going to do and what it's meant to do, and I think like Daniel explained, it's about making sure that given where you are, where you are as a country, are you meeting the kinds of requirements that you have for revenue, and how are you handling your expenditure? So for me, it's very much about what kind of, not only what kind of policies, but also how realistic, how practical these policies are to implement in the context of the socio-political landscape that the country finds itself in, not just now, but overall, and also what kind of steps does the budget take in actually implementing those and setting forth some sort of pathway for a period of time longer than the 1 year that we're talking about as well.
So, Mr. Damsingh, I'd like to ask you now, for most people who are not well versed in terms of economics and all that, it might seem a little counterintuitive that when we are going through a crisis that our budget is more expensive. Can you actually break it down and explain to us why this happens in times of crisis? How does the budget increase actually?
Right, so two things happen there. One is in terms of the net numbers, and earlier you were asking the question from Daniel on the size of the military budget, for example. So in nominal terms, in the value of rupees itself, the military budget has increased. But because we're in an inflationary environment, right, the value of money is falling, the prices of everything is rising. From 2022, I mean, inflation just fell down to about 66%. National inflation is about 70%. Next year is also going to be at least somewhat inflation based on the way it's calculated. So when you compare even our military expenditure to the size of the economy, in fact, it's falling due to this inflation. So that's part of the reason why these numbers are increasing as a cost associated with things. Just the same costs that affect us in our day-to-day lives also affect the government's costs, so those costs increase. The question is, of course, are those costs rising faster than inflation? Are they rising faster than the size of the economy is growing in rupee terms, or is it not? The other side of it is that when you're in a crisis, especially from the personal point of view, your taxes are going up, all these kinds of additional costs come on to you as an individual. And that also stems from the fact that crises like we are facing right now do also stem from problems in our budget deficit. I think Daniel also mentioned how Sri Lanka's revenue as a percentage of GDP is one of the lowest in the world. So when you're at that kind of point, and when there is where your crisis starts from, there is unfortunately no way to fix that crisis, even start thinking about fixing that crisis without fixing that side of it as well. So you're having the size of the budget increase on the back of inflation that we are all facing, but the individual cost to the person also rise because, well, that's where the problem really stem from. How that can be handled, how that can be kind of rearranged is a whole different question, and there's a question of fairness for sure. But overall, that's where those costs lie.
And as much as people are concerned about expenditure, they are also concerned about revenue. And do you think through the proposed appropriation bill and the proposed budget for the next year that the government is targeting the right avenues of income, avenues of revenue? What is your opinion on that?
So I think really, like, again, I mean, agreeing with Daniel, a lot of what Daniel said, I don't really see any other alternative. If the government wants money, either it has to borrow money. Foreign borrowing is not really possible for us. We're a country with basically no dollars. No one wants to lend to us. We can borrow locally, but that's the more and more we borrow locally, the higher and higher interest rates go. That's expensive for the government, and that has ripple effects across the rest of society as well. You could print money, but we saw what that experiment led to. That's not somewhere the kind of thing we want to experiment with again. So really the only alternative the government has, especially the only alternative the government has to move fast, because it does need to move fast, it can't wait at these ridiculously low levels of revenue, is to raise taxes. Whether these taxes could have been structured a little better, sure, but I don't think the overall structure of how these revenue proposals, for example, came about, I don't think there was very big significant differences that could have been done to get the kinds of revenues that the country needs to survive in the short term. But perhaps some changes on the margins might have been made, slightly different structures. But I think as we go forward, this kind of structure was inescapable given the context of the crisis and given the way that we ended up at the crisis that we did.
But in terms of equitable tax structure, that is what is at contention at the moment, Chayo. If you look at what is happening right now, we know that the inflation is hitting approximately over 65%. We saw a slight dip last month in terms of inflationary pressure, and the food inflation came down. But then again, when you take a look at the tax structure that has been imposed right now, it seems quite arbitrary and not equitable at all.
So I think, looking at this from two perspectives. One, from the fact who's feeling the pain, and two, like the pain itself, right? So the pain is real. There's no question about it, right? Regardless of what your level of income is, the fact that you now have to pay significantly more in taxes hits your expenditure, hits the kinds of life that you've been living, and hits you very much. And that pain is real. There's no question about it. But in terms of who gets paid, and again on the margins, these things could change. But the fact is that these taxes do hit the top 10-15% of Sri Lankans. Yes, there are some people who continue to evade these taxes, avoid paying taxes, and the government does and should move fast on fixing the issue of tax avoidance. And yes, there is a question. It's not, and also especially doesn't feel fair when people, regardless of it, 10-15% of the population, there's still 2 to 3 million people, there's still a significant number of people, have to face that pain when it especially doesn't seem like the government, when our leaders aren't necessarily doing that part. So I think there is that question of fairness, but I think we also do have to put that fairness and that question into perspective in the context of what we're doing.
No, but the question is, Chayu, look at the government appropriation bill that was tabled just a couple of days ago. Expenditure stands at 7.8 trillion. That is against 6.1 trillion that was experienced this year. So there's an increase of 1.7 trillion in government expenditure. How fair is it for government to increase its expenditure and then tax the public to the bone?
So no, I understand that question. That's very much, and especially on the surface of it, looks quite unfair. And frankly, it is, because there are people facing pain, and the government is increasing expenditure. But again, in context, one of the points is that while the government is increasing its expenditure by $1 trillion, growth, that is nominal growth in GDP terms, is probably likely to increase further than that. As a percentage of GDP relative to the size of the economy, our expenditure is actually falling. So that's, that is very much an economic point, almost a technical point there. But the fact is, it's not that the government isn't doing anything at all. It's not doing enough, I agree, and I think also in terms of the allocation problem, and I also feel like rather than the size of the expenditure, it's again, like Daniel said, it's the allocation that really counts here. Could that allocation be done significantly better? Yes. Should it be done significantly better? Very much so. Is the government doing that to the extent that it should, to the extent that it will inspire confidence? Yes, we are going through painful reforms. Is the government doing all it can to inspire confidence in this reform, to tell the people that yes, it's painful, but the pain is worth it. Look, we are also doing what we can do. I don't think the government's going far enough there, and I also don't think the government is really communicating the intensity and the requirements of this message as much as it could, as much as it needs to, in order to get public buy-in to the reform package here.
Yeah, just to add on to that, if we look at government revenue, income taxes will have to increase. The question is, do they have to increase by the amount that they have, or could there be other sources of revenue that can be mobilized to reduce the burden on the income taxpayer? I submit that there are three things that can be done on the tax side, and at least one major thing that can be done on the non-tax side. With respect to taxation, the first is the proper capture of the asset price increases that have taken place over the last decade or so, especially in land. We already have the system of rates in place. These are by and large not valued at market values or nowhere near market values. So simply by ensuring that rates are charged at the rate at true market values could be a significant source of revenue that can reduce the revenue mobilization required from income tax. In addition, if we look at the gaming sector, the tobacco, alcohol, and the petroleum sectors, basically sectors where there's excise taxes involved, the companies there are reporting very large profits. And there, again, there could be measures taken either through the use of formulas to ensure that revenue is captured appropriately, or by changing the structure of taxation. For example, gaming, in many countries, they have a tax on the top line, on revenue itself, rather than on income, to ensure that there isn't any evasion or avoidance. And then moving on to the non-revenue side of things, there are still huge amounts of assets that the government holds. We have the state banks, we have the ports, we have the airports, we have Sri Lankan Airlines still. All these assets can be used to, can be liquidated essentially and used to settle debt. That will mean, at least for the next couple of years, while the economy goes through this difficult period, we won't have to increase taxes as much if the state can mobilize those resources.
So if you look at overall the current picture, let's take a look at the statement that was made by Ranil Wickremesinghe on the 16th of October. He said that he spoke to the Minister of Finance in China with regard to Sri Lanka's debt standing. And then a few days later, we heard that the Chinese Minister of Finance has resigned from his portfolio after the party convention that took place several days ago, Chayu. So if you look at all these developments that are taking place right now, these are negatives for the government, isn't it?
So I think when you look at the timeline that the government has set, getting these assurances from our bilateral creditors primary, getting them to agree to talk to us, that's basically the first step that's required under the IMF's, this lending into arrears policy it's called. Getting that done by December and then getting board level approval by December. Considering that timeline, it seems quite negative, because if these kinds of things continue to happen, it starts to seem unlikely. Can we really meet that timeline? But I think the question is also, is that timeline going to be delayed by a month or two, or is it going to be something that gets delayed, a year or two, significant amounts of time? I don't yet see any reason that the timeline is going to be delayed by inordinate amounts of time. It might be delayed a little bit, but I'm broadly of the view, at least personally, that there are delays that are happening, but these delays aren't significant enough to derail the process that we're on. They're just slight hiccups as far as I see right now. If things get significantly worse, of course that story changes, but I don't see anything, massive derailment of the process just as yet.
Chayu, I recollect several weeks ago when I interviewed on Face the Nation the governor of the central bank, Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe. He said that by the end of this year, we will have the IMF tranche on board. That's $700 million that we were talking about. But it seems like a elusive goal right now, because China has not said that they are willing to restructure Sri Lanka's debt. Debt sustainability is one of the primary concerns of the IMF as well. So given all these factors right now, all these goals that have been put forward by the Sri Lankan government in the eyes of the general public seem to be far elusive to achieve.
I mean, they're always going to be, these goals are always going to be difficult to achieve. The government also, and even from the role of, say, a senior official, such as the governor of the central bank, it's also that you can't really set a goal that's too pessimistic, because that affects markets and affects the ability to reach that goal in itself. So it is a fine balance that officials of the government would have to reach as well. Giving and providing a goalpost that is plausible to reach in some realistic point, and one from which there isn't going to be a significant delay. Yes, it does not look good. I agree, especially if there's a lot riding on the specific point of December, and there is a lot of narrative around that. That does not look good. That does affect sentiment. That does affect how the public looks at it. But again, is it going to be delayed to January, February? I don't think that kind of delay has a huge impact on the pathway of the economy. If it gets delayed to August, September next year, if it gets delayed to 2024, that of course is far more significant. I don't think things are looking that bad. A few months delay might be possible, but so far it does not look like anything beyond that is likely. And the kinds of delays that could be possible are unlikely, in my view, to have significant changes to the pathway that we're on. A delay, a hiccup perhaps, significant in its own right, but not something that will change the trajectory and take us back months or years into the past.
Daniel, if I may ask you now, you also have a background in diplomacy, right? So when it comes to the IMF staff level agreement, now the government has come up with a closed doors policy. They won't disclose the discussions and what they've agreed upon with the IMF as of yet. Now this makes sense in I would say a diplomatic point of view, but then the people are always questioning as to why the secrecy, and it makes people nervous. So what is the rationale behind this secrecy into these agreements?
So in general, government-to-government agreements often are negotiated in secret simply because it means that it avoids public scrutiny, and sometimes there are good reasons for that, including it avoids disclosing things to third countries. In the case of an IMF program, that doesn't really apply as much. In my personal opinion, I think that there is good reason for the government to make such an agreement public, or the staff level agreement public, in its own interest, because this is the moment when which appetite for reform is the greatest. And it is important for the public to understand that these are the measures that must be taken in order to put Sri Lanka on the course to recovery and then hopefully towards prosperity. So this is the time to communicate to the public the urgency and importance of these needs, and the staff level agreement is just one other way in which that can be done. So I'm of the view that it should be released. However, I don't think it's a major problem either way, because none of these are binding commitments. Only at the level of a board agreement does it become a binding commitment. So the government of Sri Lanka has not really bound itself to anything at this point. So I don't think it's a major issue either way, but I think it's a lost opportunity.
But
but the consequences of this secrecy now, it's making the public more anxious. So do you think that so are you saying that this will have no effect at all on the binding agreement that the board level agreement that we will be signing eventually?
No, so only once, think of it as a draft contract at the moment. Only once the contract is signed will it bind the government of Sri Lanka, and that will be once the board approves it and Sri Lanka takes on the debt that comes from that first tranche. Until that point, it's basically a draft contract, which is what a staff level agreement more or less is.
Chayu, over the last few years, when every time a budget is to be presented to Sri Lanka, the general notion has been there should not be international intervention in the budget. This has been stated several times by powerhouses of the then government, individuals in the caliber of Vimal Weerawansa, Udayagam Mampila, Vasudeva Nanayakkara. They've always said it has to be a homegrown budget. But it seems like budget 2023 bears the hallmark of an IMF intervention.
So, I mean, I'm not going to make a comment on what individual political members have been speaking about, but what I'd say is this. I don't think that any budget that we've had in the past is going to be has been significantly removed from any form of international, no, I won't use the term intervention, but some sort of influence, right? Because whatever kind of budget we've had, it's had policies with regards to import, it has policies with regards to export. Unless you're trying to make a budget that is completely isolationist, you can't really avoid some sort of international influence. Whenever you're talking about trade, you are talking about the other side of the coin, which is another country and how that country thinks about it. There is always some sort of diplomatic influence, some sort of diplomatic awareness at least that's happening directly. It might not be a direct impact on the budget saying do XYZ policy, which yes, when you're alongside an IMF program that happens. But even still, I think it's that although the IMF is not part of the kind of reform package that we are kind of going on, it's also that these policy measures that the government is taking, it would have to do regardless of whether the IMF is on board or not. We would anyway have to raise revenue of the government. We would anyway have to maintain or at least start to look at these expenditure issues as well. We would anyway have to have these, for example, on the monetary policy as well, the measures that have been taken so far, these would have anyway have had to happen given the crisis that we're in. The IMF is an additional support that essentially gives us a little additional money to help start us along the package, and also in its own views through the policies that in addition to the ones that are essential, tries to kind of keep us in line. So whether that is something that is fair for a country to have, whether that's something that's unfair, whether that's some sort of international intervention, I'd leave that up to someone who has expertise in the matter. For me, from the point of view of the economics of it, are we getting the right policies in? If you're getting the right policies in, I'm happy with that.
But Chai, when you say the IMF is trying to keep us online, does that mean that we've not been online the last few years, last few decades, following the 1977 open economy came into play, and that is why we are in this mess right now?
I would say since before that, I'd say since independence, we've been in this continuous mess time and time again. We've been initially, yes, we had some expenditure problems in the 50s, 1950s, for example. A lot of our expenditure was tied to the rice subsidy that we had at the point, which was very variable because it moved around with the price of rice in the global market. So that is part of the reason that, for example, Dadli Senayaka's government had a political crisis at that point. Now, since then, as the economy has grown, the size of both our expenditure and revenue numbers have fallen to the point that over the last 15-20 years, this has become more of a revenue issue than an expenditure issue. But this problem where we have this negative deficit, we have this deficit on the government's rupee side, and that has been also on the import side of things, directly or indirectly subsidizing the consumption of imports in our society, led to the dollar deficit in our trade and current accounts. And to meet those two deficits, we need to take on debt. Cyclically, we've been moving through that. At some points, reducing those two deficits and therefore reducing the relative value of debt we had to meet at a certain point. But then as those problems reduce, we've been increasing those two deficits again, as that has been politically expedient in the short term, because that's the structure of Sri Lanka's economy over the last year. So cyclically, we've been going through that process, nothing really too new.
Very interestingly, when you spoke about the Dadli Senayaka era with regard to the rice pact that Sri Lanka had, I want to drag your attention to the 1970s, where Sirma Bandaranaike, when she came into the political fora, she said that she will bring rice even from the moon if it requires for the people of the country. But since then, we've not learned a lesson even by 2022. Right now, in 2010, 2011, Sri Lanka had an excess of rice. We were ready to even export rice to the international market. Today, we are taking a begging bowl to international donors for rice to be imported to the country. All this because of government mismanagement, isn't it?
So one side of that argument, one side of that point rather, is that if you take the point at which we had a surplus of rice and we were quote-unquote ready to export, the question is who would have bought rice from us, because a lot of the rice that we had was costly to produce. I'm not saying that Sri Lanka shouldn't produce any rice, grow any rice. There are food security concerns which just purely depending on an import supply. But even our local production of rice is still import dependent because it's dependent on imported fertilizer. In Sri Lanka's case, we have very little in Sri Lanka that is purely made from within the country. Most of what we have, most of what we consume, directly or indirectly, import driven. So it's not only mismanagement, but it's also the fact that the structure of the Sri Lankan economy for 70 odd years, and in realistically extending even before independence, has been on this point where growth and the size of the economy, all of this has been based on import driven consumption. And if you're structuring economy around imports, that means you want to keep the price of imports low, you want to control the exchange rate, and that is antithetical, that is counter to growing the export side and getting revenue on that side. So it's not just a mismanagement problem, but it's also a priority problem that the government has had, and the government has explicitly, governments across the decades have explicitly decided that this is the kind of structure that they want to go along with. That's not necessarily only mismanagement, that's not necessarily only corruption. It could also be a sincere belief that this is the growth model that a country like Sri Lanka needs to go through. The question is, if you're running a country like that with twin deficits, how long can you sustainably go through that? Because as long as you're in deficit, you need to borrow to fix that. And at one point, you've borrowed so much you can't deal with it, which is what we're facing now, which is to a lesser extent what we faced at multiple crises throughout our modern economic history.
Now, Suchai, just to ask you now, it seems like you're implying that Sri Lanka, at least in the short term, has very little hope in terms of injecting money into industries and developing export-oriented fields like the government is trying to do. So do you think that we don't have hope? And if we are injecting money into developing or maximizing our exports, what should we focus on?
So I think it's not that we don't have hope. There are places that we can do well, because these are places we've already shown ourselves capable of making change. So, I mean, a few things that immediately come to mind, of course, is the tourism sector took a big hit due to primarily the pandemic, and then the situation that continued to develop in the country, all the crises that we had. So, as we move forward, there will be a recovery. It is unlikely, I think, for it to be a recovery back to the previous peaks. Things have changed in Sri Lanka, things have changed globally. Travel, the global economy is different, but tourism is one place that we could do well. The apparel sector also has some track record of doing well, track record of improvement. The IT sector, yes, there are questions, for example, with the labor force right now, but the labor force has been a problem for the IT sector, not just now with the crisis, but it has been a problem for quite some time as well, as I understand it. But even that's been something that's been growing, that has the potential to improve. Value-added agriculture is another place. But beyond that, it's also that we need to recognize that building up industry, building up a specific area that we can earn dollars in, takes time. We can't do that overnight.
It's a significant investment as well.
It's a significant investment. It takes time. You need to find suppliers, you need to find buyers, you need to set up credibility as a good product in the market. You need to make sure that the global economy, the market is ready for it. You need the expertise to do that on the ground, especially if you haven't had that. If you are controlling the exchange rate and keeping it artificially low to a point where your exports aren't competitive, then that's a factor as well. So you do need to work on all of these factors. There are things that we can do. We should first focus on what we are already shown some track record, some level of skill at, and then we can move into other sectors. There's opportunities in energy, for example. There's opportunity in, for example, the mineral sands industries. There are opportunities. It'll take time for us to explore those opportunities, but we need to start on what you can do and start on looking at the future as well, for sure.
And Daniel, interestingly, talking about the IT industry, like if you look at India, they had a huge growth in terms of investing into the IT industry, and that yielded a lot of benefits for the country. Do you think Sri Lanka has the potential, or do you think we should focus on that more than we are right now?
So I think the question for the government is, what do you prioritize? Because the market will do a great deal of stuff by itself. The question here is, what should the government do? The government, with respect largely to export industries, is two things. One, get out of the way, and two, create an enabling environment. Getting out of the way means removing restrictions that are in place for foreign investment. If you look at, for example, the shipping and logistics sector, there are a number of restrictions on foreign ownership that mean that some of the world's biggest players with the latest technology, the latest practices, are not operating in Sri Lanka. What it means to get out of the way is to reduce the regulation that is involved. If you want to build a factory, the number of permissions that are required and the complexity of those processes
and the corruption involved in it,
and the corruption, all of this is tremendous. So that's one thing, getting the government out of the way. The second is creating an enabling environment for export industries. What does this mean? This means ensuring basic things like uninterrupted power. but also providing the educational inputs that are required in terms of building up human capital and physical infrastructure as well. If you look at the Sri Lankan public expenditure over the last couple of decades, a huge amount of it has actually gone into subsidizing low productivity, precarious dry zone agriculture, as opposed to export industries through the development of, for example, public transportation infrastructure, because that improves labor mobility. It means that you can have more people working in your factory with different skill sets, and reduces the cost of transporting things, which is actually quite important. If you look at industrial zone occupancy rates, the further you are from the port and airport, the lower the occupancy rates are, almost in a linear sort of way. So I think that's another area to focus on. And all of this, in terms of enabling factors, I think there's two other things that I would prioritize, which is the land market and the labor market. These two markets are absolutely critical for the development of any export sector. And so far, in the last 30 or 40 years, there's been very little effort made to resolve some of the constraints in those two domains. The government holds huge amounts of land that it does not use productively. It should lease those out. It should develop industrial parks that are ideally privately managed as well, that solve some of these many constraints that investors face. With respect to the labor market, there are a number of labor laws that are utterly archaic and not fit for anyone's purpose, either labor or capital. And there's a desperate need to reform some of those as well. So hopefully those will come in the budget as well.
And also Sri Lanka, one thing that we can be proud about is the free education system, because it enabled, in terms of economy, the labor force to be more equipped in terms of, like, for example, illiteracy is almost wiped out from Sri Lanka.
I'm sorry, I'd beg to differ on that, because if you look at the O-level maths fail rate, it hovers between 40 and 50%. And if you fail O-level maths, it means you're failing O-levels as well. So that means of the 16-year-olds who sit the main public exam, 40 to 50% are failing in a given year, and they're failing because of possibly the most important subject in the syllabus, and one that is critical for any cognitive or technical work, including on a factory floor. So while we may have done a reasonable job at educating people how to read a sentence, we've done a fairly poor job of educating them in terms of preparing them for the labor force. And I think that is one figure that constantly astounds me, the fact that there isn't more attention paid by the government or by other actors to improve this rate, and whilst ensuring that the quality of the exam remains the same. There have been attempts to relax the examination as well. So while keeping the exam quality constant, really pushing to reduce that number, I think, should be a critical priority.
If you look at the exchange interest rates right now, Daniel, it seems something is wrong with the interest rates of the banks that are offering at the moment. The borrowing rate is at 28%, whereas the treasury bills are going at around 31%, 3-month treasury bills. So what people could do is ideally borrow at 28% and reinvest in treasury bills at the end of the day. And who is losing from this equation? It's the government again.
So what accounts for that is the risk premium on government securities. The market is not confident that the government will repay those bills and bonds in full. So that's basically what explains for the spread between those two numbers.
So do you think that the government may take a haircut in treasury bills going forward?
I think nothing can be outruled at this point.
So there is a possibility?
It's always a possibility, especially in such an uncertain and volatile environment as the current one.
So then the people again would be losing, because I spoke to someone in Lebanon just a couple of days ago who said that he had invested his money in the Lebanon banks because of high interest rates, and overnight the Lebanese banks had said that they won't be paying these individuals in question who had gone and invested their money or saved their money in treasury bills. So a situation like that may happen in Sri Lanka?
We saw that happen to the international bondholders. There's always a possibility.
So are you cautioning the public when investing in treasury bills to take a cautionary approach?
My simple view is that generally the market has a reasonably, over time at least, has a reasonably good job of pricing assets, including things like treasury bills. So the fact that you're getting such a high return is probably a reflection of its risk. And I say high return relative to other asset classes at the moment.
Chayu, now the government, there is discussions in the grapevine that export sector like the agricultural export sector, the tea, the rubber, the coconut cultivations would be taxed in the future as far as the 2023 budget is concerned. Do you see this happening?
So I think one part of this, the fact that export profits would also be under a corporate income tax scheme, comes from the fact that there is a push globally to set this minimum corporate income tax of 30%. There will be holdouts for that policy globally. There will be, especially in the kind of more tax haven economies whose economy is based on this idea of getting foreign investors and foreign companies set up, cost centers in their economies. Outside of that, does this serve as an additional disincentive, especially since a lot of exporters would pay a lower level of tax, since there's an added part of their profit that goes to the government? Does it serve as a little bit of a disincentive? Probably. But I think the other part of it is that there's a significant part of Sri Lanka's export sector that doesn't pay any tax at all, corporate income tax at all, and that stems from different exemptions provided to them through different provisions. So there's the question: if you're having, especially in a environment of depreciation, and of course right now costs are high, inflation is high, but these things do stabilize over time, especially with the measures that have been taken. So you have this depreciating pathway. You do have some sort of extra export competitiveness as a result of that. And there are plenty of exporters making significant profits. So is it fair that a huge part of the economy then pays zero corporate income tax? I think that's also a serious question to think about. But I think, so part of the reason that the export tax is rising as much as fast is to do with the fact that a lot of these exemptions still continue. So I think a better discussion would be in terms of how can we move to not having 40, 50 years of tax breaks for companies that make pretty large profits. How can we move to a structure that is, to use your own term, to be more equitable?
But Chayu, won't that discourage the exporters?
So I don't think there's a lot of, evidence globally that the only reason that people get involved in a business is the low tax rates. So I think generally across the board, across countries, the fact that you have profits being taxed at some level does mean, that is a fact there. And I think if there is a firm that stops their production, stops their activities purely on the basis of tax, perhaps that business might not have been extremely productive in the first place. This kind of structure for that kind of firms, a firm that is run purely on the margins, this kind of action could in fact encourage that to move into more productive aspects of their own business. Does this serve as a disincentive, since a lot of firms, especially export firms, would have been used to a completely different tax structure? Very much, I think that does happen. But I don't necessarily think that excluding a huge chunk of the economy from taxes is good policy in itself. It might, I think concessionary tax rates for exporters might be where it could end up in and where it should end up in, but I don't personally think that excluding export revenue, export profit from taxes.
But let's take a look at the tea industry for an example, Chayu. This year already there is a 42 million kilogram crop shortfall because fertilizer was not applied. Now many exporters are looking at going overseas. Most of the companies in Sri Lanka have established operations in countries like Kenya. Most of the companies have established operations in countries like Poland. Most of the export companies have started operations in countries like Dubai. So they are leaving the country. So when there is a high tax regime in the country for exporters, what would eventually happen is these exporters will leave the country and set up shop elsewhere. And who's going to be the big loser at the end of the day? It's going to be the government of Sri Lanka.
So I think the point is the very examples that you use points to the fact that exporters have been leaving the country well before this tax regime came into place. They've been leaving for very many reasons, including labor problems, including the business environment not being very friendly, including the fact that Sri Lanka as a country has been consistently trying to suppress its exchange rate, especially over the last 10 to 15 years. We borrow dollars, we use those borrowed dollars to suppress the exchange rate, reducing the ability of exporters to earn more and more revenue. I think those kinds of factors have been significant reasons for exporters to move out of the country. There is, yes, a global idea that exporters do move cost centers to countries where there is low tax. That's going to happen, really, unless Sri Lanka can structure its own economy to that same model, where our economic model is based on the fact that we have low taxes, but everyone comes here because it's such a great place to do business in. Sri Lanka is not a great place to do business in. Let's be frank.
That's very evident.
That's very evident.
There is no question about it. So let's take a look at countries like Vietnam. Let's take a look at countries like Bangladesh, for an example, which offers very cost-effective labor and sometimes a tax haven as well.
So that's, I think, when you are not a place that is very easy to do business in, then the only people that, not the only people, but a significant chunk at least of the people who come into your country newly on the basis of tax breaks are there purely for the tax break reason. So I have a question personally. Is that the kind of industry that we want in a country, that we want to encourage in a country? Do we also want to encourage the businesses, encourage investment in the country that also has more widespread impacts as well?
So practically tell me who will come to Sri Lanka and invest in a situation like that, where you have to pay high taxes, labor is very expensive. Which companies would be attracted to come to Sri Lanka?
I think the reason that companies...
Overall, let's take a look at the global environment for say. Tell me which company would come and invest in Sri Lanka, given the current context?
The reason that I think companies don't come and invest in Sri Lanka is not because of tax reasons. I think companies don't come and invest in Sri Lanka because of the other reasons that have been consistent reasons why companies have not invested in Sri Lanka. That's not a new phenomenon. That's been a phenomenon that's been happening for decades, if not longer. I think those reasons need to be fixed first before looking at the tax thing as a primary thing. I think the primary reason companies haven't set up in Sri Lanka will have been those other reasons. Without fixing those other reasons, I don't think fixing taxes alone automatically brings massive amounts of investment.
Daniel, what are your thoughts?
My thought on this is, why would a company invest for export purposes in Sri Lanka? It's if they can produce the goods cheaper than in another destination. Tax is one component of that, and often not a very significant component. The other components that matter are the price of land, the price of building your factory, the price of your labor adjusted for productivity, the price of red tape, the price of the currency, the exchange rate, the stability of that, and so on and so forth. So there are many factors. Taxes may be one component and could be an important component. I'd like to make 2 points as well on that. The first is that even if we were to structure a tax that acted as a de facto subsidy on exports, I see very little reason to subsidize a 200-year-old industry. If at all, we want to provide some form of subsidy to exports, we should do it for exporters who are exporting under new HS codes, not under HS codes we've been exporting for decades or even longer. The second is, insofar as we are going to tax things, I agree with Chayu that some level of concessional taxation for the export sector, particularly in new HS codes, would be helpful. And instead of imposing such a high tax rate, just like on the public that we discussed earlier, if there are other revenue sources that can be used, that can be quite helpful. If we look at, for example, excise duties on petrol and diesel, if you look at the UK, nearly 50% of the pump price is tax. In India, it's somewhere between 25 and 36%. In Australia, it's 29 to 35%. In the US, it's somewhere between 11 and 14%. In Sri Lanka, it's somewhere between 7 and 12. We have a very low tax rate on petroleum products, which is why companies like IOC are able to report these huge profits.
But then there's a big question mark. How are they going to take their money back to their home country?
That's a separate matter. What I'm saying here is there's significant sources of revenue mobilization that exist in the economy today that can be utilized, that are more equitable, because in particular, petrol, for example, subsidies are highly regressive. Generally, it's people who own motor cars who consume petrol, which are in the top 5 to 10% of society.
But if you look at companies, let's take a look at the global context, for an example. Daniel, let's take Iran for an example. Iran in the early 1970s did extremely well. And after the 1970s, when the Shah fell and the spiritual leader took over the helm of leadership in Iran, things were not looking that great. And as a result, today we see that the currency in Iran depreciating a lot more. And many companies in England, many companies in Sweden, many companies from Norway went and invested their money in Iran during this period in question, and now they're struggling to take their money out. So why would a foreign investor come to Sri Lanka and invest when the conducive environment for doing business is not that great?
Yeah, so we need to work on making our costs lower, on making it a competitive place to manufacture things. And that's a number of efforts. It involves the land market, it involves the labor market, it involves reducing tariffs, it involves fixing red tape problems. There's a whole range of reform measures that need to take place, many of which are contained, I imagine, in the staff level agreement, but also other more long-standing measures that need to be taken. This is not a quick fix. There's no quick fix for this.
But isn't this why the government has to focus its attention on the country to make sure that the ground for doing business is somewhat well and good? And if
that's
not,
precisely, I think, what the both of us are saying.
Yeah, if not, the situation will be bad, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's very much what we're saying. The environment for doing business has to improve. That comes from a host of factors. And I think this tax increase is just one part of it. It's a very new part of it. Will it affect this of business? Yes, but I think globally as well, the evidence has generally been that these other factors as a whole tend to be the primary reasons why companies invest, rather than tax alone. It's to make a good deal, to make a good profit, because you're manufacturing things either cheaply, you're making a good product, productivity is high. These are reasons why you do business, not primarily tax.
What I don't understand is, now the government is looking at imposing a tax on the tea, rubber and the coconut industry, which brings in somewhat of approximately around 3 to 4 billion US dollars of revenue a year as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. And then we heard President Ranil Wickremesinghe addressing the 32nd annual general meeting of the Sri Lanka Factory Owners Association, saying that the country has a very competitive tea industry that needs to be modernized. Now I'm trying to figure out what's the connection between these two. Now, in one side, the president wants to promote exports and ensure that the tea industry is modernized. And on the other hand, there is discussions in the grapevine saying that a tax will be imposed on the tea, rubber and the coconut industry. Now, this was published in the weekend newspapers as well.
Yeah, so I think those two things go in line, because if the tea industry, let's take the tea industry as an example here, or even the tea, rubber, coconut industries, if there has been no incentive for the agricultural sector in Sri Lanka to modernize, perhaps the tax will serve as an incentive as well in order to push their productivity in order to modernize. I think the primary reason behind the tax is not that. I think the primary reason behind the tax is the government is finding every way possible that it can easily get some sort of revenue into its coffers. Could it do better? And should it do better? Very much. I think there are more equitable. You can spread the burden among. There are significant chunks of society that still pay zero tax, that have the perfect ability to pay tax. There's a lot of taxable revenue that exists that is taxed essentially effectively at 0%. So can we move into those? And should we move into those? Yes. Is there enough being done to move into those? I don't think so. I agree with you that we need to move into those areas as well. So that can reduce the overall burden, especially what these new proposals are, to a lower level.
Right now, it seems, Chayu, the government, as you said correctly, is on a witch hunt to tax everything that moves.
So I think the point is that the government needs revenue right now. If the government doesn't have revenue right now, the
at
state
what
can't function.
cost? Again, all this, isn't it short term? All this, isn't it knee-jerk decisions that we are taking? Shouldn't these actions be sustainable at the end of the day?
So I think it's also to do with the alternative, right? Is there a feasible alternative that can be done in a short enough time period that can also avoid this alternative negative case, where that is where the state does not have revenue to function and the state stops really functioning to the extent that it does.
So Shami, why aren't you asking me why JR Container Terminal isn't privatized? We're talking of a couple of $100 million worth of assets. Why are we not talking about SLT being privatized? Why are we not talking about the state banks being privatized? We are talking about significant chunks of money that can be used at this moment to move to a GDP, tax to GDP ratio in a slightly more gradual way that can smoothen this process out. Why are you not asking me this question?
You answer. Well, that's a very precise point. Why SLTB? Why Sri Lankan Airlines? Why
all of these things?
Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. Why aren't these organizations privatized?
That's right. By divesting those assets, immediately loss-making enterprises, the government won't have to pay those losses. It will mobilize revenue that will allow the process of raising taxes to happen in a more phased way, in a more thoughtful way. And I think it's an important source of cash to smoothen this process out at this critical juncture. And it'll bring in foreign capital, technology, managerial practices that will really drive growth. And that's one of the things that's been so frustrating about the conversation in the country today, that this is not being pushed for in a major way by many of the players who are affected. And just to continue on the tax point as well, I'll give you two examples of where government policy could have a really big impact on exports over the last 2 decades, but hasn't. Between somewhere around 2003 or 2004 and 2016 or 17, not a single industrial zone was built in this country, despite many of them being at full capacity. Biyagama and Katnayaka industrial zones have been full for nearly 2 decades. Has the government made any effort to expand them? Has the government made any effort to upgrade them? No. So there's a huge amount of stuff the government can do to promote exports that doesn't involve necessarily reducing taxes. But if there's one tax that I think could help in terms of tourism, is the airport embarkation and disembarkation levy. It basically makes a tourist coming to Sri Lanka have to pay considerably higher and reduces the competitiveness, especially with respect to the massive Indian tourism market that is booming at the moment.
And also, Daniel, I think there are concerns,
especially. Just give me a second. I just want to ask a follow-up question, if you don't mind, sir. Now, you were advising the Ministry of Finance at one point during the Mangala Samarweera era, Daniel. Why wasn't all this discussed then?
It was. Many of the proposals outlined that were discussed today were in the budget speech, and some of them were implemented, some of them were not, primarily due to the fact that there was a coalition government, and a coalition government that completely broke down post the constitutional coup in November 2018.
But even before that, let's take Sri Lankan Airlines for an example. There was discussions that at one point Sri Lankan Airlines will be even go to the extent of closing down. And I recollect in 2018, prior to the constitutional coup, that was in June, when the financials were out, Minister Kabir Hashim declared that the Sri Lankan Airlines would go as a going concern. And that meant that more money had to be pumped to Sri Lankan Airlines as a result. So it's very clear, though the intention was there, practically you couldn't do any of these because of the situations with regard to trade unions and so on and so forth.
No, I think that it was the fact that there was a coalition government that was the primary factor. And a secondary factor was we didn't have the crisis that we have today. And people didn't understand the gravity and importance of those reforms, which hopefully there is a greater appreciation of at this current juncture.
And also, Daniel, now there's a lot of sensitivity around the fact of selling national assets. This has been a conversation that has been in the talks for a long time, ever since the Chinese debt trap topic came up and the debt burden that Sri Lanka is currently under. So now, from what I collect, from what I understand, from what you're saying that we need to move these assets in order to bridge the gap in our debt burden. So in that sense, and also Shamir brought up this argument about the trade unions and the pushback from society when it comes to privatizing the national assets. So how do we work around this? How do we achieve the perfect balance here?
So in my mind, if you're selling an asset to settle a liability, there is no change in terms of your balance sheet. So I don't understand the argument that you're selling a national asset. If you're using it to settle national liabilities, it's effectively the same thing from your capital position. But let's leave that accounting aside. How do you actually go about doing this? I think it's a matter of political will and communication. And that's the business of government and the business of politicians in particular. What the role perhaps of a program like this is to simply discuss these ideas and to have people contribute in terms of shaping how people ought to think about this. But yeah, I don't really understand the argument that something is a national asset. Yes, any asset that the government holds is a national asset. Any liability that the government holds is a national liability. So if you're swapping one for another, I don't understand what the issue is.
And also the whole conversation around now, there are still people in the country who talk about how during Sirimao's time, if it continued, the country would be in a better state in terms of the government actually operating enterprises. And there are some people who still promote that ideology. So in your expert opinion as an economist and as a financial advisor, do you think if we did continue properly this socialist idea of state-owned enterprises and state-run businesses, do you think that the country would be in a better place?
I'll just make two arguments. First is, if you look at per capita GDP growth, it's basically a flat line until 1978, and then it goes like this. Sri Lanka first had its economic takeoff post the liberalization in 1977. It was flawed in many ways, yes. However, that was the starting point for some of the relative prosperity and well-being we have today. The second point is, I think post the collapse of the Soviet Union and the state of North Korea, Cuba, and so on and so forth, there's no debate on that particular topic and the particular structure that was envisioned under the United Front government in the 70s.
So ideally you're saying the people need to move on from that and basically understand that it's not sustainable. So, but how do we educate the people? How do we take it to them?
You're
this
the
idea.
person in media, you should be telling us.
As economists, like basically now it's mostly complex, right? Even like, for example, I would admit that there are some economic concepts that I don't understand. So when it comes to diversifying or like basically taking the knowledge to the people, what can the government do in terms of like education reforms or policy reforms? Like what would you suggest?
I think what really matters is not convincing people of particular policy X or Y, but commanding the trust and confidence of the population. If political leaders can command their trust and confidence, they will be able to push through what is required. And that, of course, is partly the art of charisma, partly the art of credibility, and partly the art of communication in terms of setting a vision and painting a picture of where we need to go and how we're going to get there. So I think that's fundamentally a political question that you're asking.
So as of now, do you think we are on the right track? This is high time we correct our wrongs. Do you think we are on the right track?
I think it's the right track, wrong track. It's a very difficult thing to say, but I think historically Sri Lankan governments have been very bad at communicating on economic issues. I don't think this government's any particular exception.
Shai, interesting thoughts by Daniel on how the Sri Lankan governments over the last few years have been able to communicate economic decisions to the people is a big question mark. But let's leave that aside for the moment and let's look at the budget, the appropriation bill that was tabled just a couple of days ago. The government intends to bring down the budget deficit to 6.8% next year from the 9.9% this year. Steep target, isn't it? A very, very steep target. How would the government do this? It seems like they have to pull a rabbit out of a black hat.
So I think it also comes from the fact that, so I'd explain it like this, right? So there's this country in East Africa, Burundi, one of the, if not the poorest country in the world. You're talking about 60-70% of the population barely having access to drinking water. Government ministries being, partly broken down shacks in abandoned warehouses. You're talking about 1 in 10 kids dying before the age of 5. Sri Lanka's government is poorer than Burundi's government. That's how bad our tax revenue problem is. That's how bad our government revenue problem is. And budget deficit, the reason why our budget deficit became so high to that double-digit level, it's in fact closer to about double-digit level, is because our tax revenue was so low. So when you're starting from the absolute bottom, moving up a step is not too hard. Improving the budget deficit to those numbers is not too hard. What's going to be harder is moving and sustaining that over the long term and making the improvements from that first step onwards. So I think that the first movement in terms of the budget deficit, especially when they're looking at the primary deficit, that's essentially the government's expenditure for the given year, excluding interest costs, compared to the government's overall overall revenue. I think a big improvement in 1 year, very possible. Beyond that, continuing and improving, consistently improving that, I think that's going to be a much harder measure. The first improvement, I think the kinds of policy measures that have been taken right now, announced right now, probably will get you at least very close to that target. But moving from that point onwards, because that's still, you're barely surviving at that point, moving from that point onwards will require all of the things that we talked about.
The World Bank predicts a negative growth rate for Sri Lanka this year, and then going forward turns out to make it a little bit positive as far as the forecast is concerned. Do you think at least this would be a possibility?
So I think the reason that growth is falling, contracting so sharply, is to do with the fact that the structure of Sri Lanka's economy is basically import driven, right? Moving back, I'll give you a simple example for this. Late March this year, when we had those 12-hour power cuts, right? You wake up in the morning, power cuts for 6 hours, you have 2 to 3 hours with power, and then power cuts until 12 in the night. At that kind of point, the economy doesn't function, right? You can't go to work, you can't get ready to go to work. You go to work, there's no power there. You come back home, you can't cook food, the power's out, the light's out. If you're running a factory, there's no power to run that. The diesel's out for the generator. All of that really doesn't function at that point. So however much money the government had, however much money the individual business owner, the individual worker in the factory had, you couldn't get past that fact. You couldn't get past the fact that the economy was not working at that point. And imagine if that continued for an extended period of time. So the reason why any amount of money would not have worked at that point is simply because the fact that it was a dollar problem that we had. We simply did not have the dollars to run our generators, to get the critical imports that we needed at that point. Outside of that, the rest of Sri Lanka's economy is also dependent quite a lot, indirectly or directly, on imports. And that's been the structure of the economy for, I would say that has increased significantly over the last 15-20 years, but has been a factor, for a century or more before that as well, before independence, in my view. So when you have a economy, the structure of which is based on importing materials and then consuming them locally, the moment you start to do a point. So remember, the reason that we are able to do that, either we need dollars to import that we earn ourselves, or we need to borrow dollars from elsewhere. We haven't been earning enough dollars to do that import ourselves, which means we have been running that import-dependent growth economy through debt. It's been a debt import-driven economy. We come to a point where we can't borrow that kind of money. The debt has ballooned to such an extent that we can't handle that cost. No one's giving us any more debt. So you come to a point where the way that the Sri Lankan economy has worked simply does not work anymore. The economy has hit a sudden stop, and it takes time for that. So that's the reason why this year, and very likely next, it's a very, very tough period for the growth side of the economy. So the idea behind the slow recovery afterwards, and it's not going to 6, 7, 8% growth, is that and that's also a policy decision, and that's also a projection that's being made, is that Sri Lanka doesn't return to that import level growth paradigm. Partly because Sri Lanka is still not going to be able to borrow these significant amounts of money in order to handle that import-driven economy. So we are going to have to make do without that the primarily import-driven trajectory, which ideally would move us towards that export-driven strategy. But in the meantime, growth is going to be slow. I think that's the idea behind it. Whether that works out to the maximum extent that is envisioned, I'm not too optimistic.
But what I don't understand is, Shah, you seem to be very optimistic about the country's economy. You say that within the next few years, Sri Lanka would recover from this situation. But don't you think that if we do not arrest these problems that are fundamentally there in the Sri Lankan economy, we might even file for default once again in the next 10 years?
So, very much. We need to address the problems in the economy. So the question is, what drives us to fix these problems? Over the last 70 years, we made piecemeal changes because we never really had the impetus. There was never really the requirement, the drive to get that across. So that came not only from government, not only from politicians elected to decide policy, but also from the structure of the economy from the ground up. As long as the economy is dependent on import, plenty of people, perfectly honest people with perfectly legitimate interests, are going to get closer to that side of the economy because that's the part that works. That's where the growth is. That's where the jobs are. That's where your income is going to grow. So you're going to get along with that side of the equation. So not only from the top, but also from the bottom, there has been a general reluctance to move away from that structure to fix the specific problems.
In terms of the budget that we just saw, like, do you think these problems are being addressed and we are allocating money in the right places? If not, where do you think we should allocate our money at?
So I think primarily the budget's role here is not to subsidize the areas that have led to these problems in the past. Now, the appropriation bill provides some broad understanding of where the allocations are going to go, but there's still plenty that the details still need to come out in the budget speech on where the specifics are going to go. So I can't really comment on that. There will be an improvement, I think. We are at a point where there is no alternative but to make an improvement. Is it going to be enough of an improvement that takes Sri Lanka from where we are to this really great place? I mean, I highly doubt that's going to happen. But also the fact that Sri Lanka is the first country to face this specific type of crisis. Plenty of countries in the past have faced this. The general trend has been that countries improve. Not that countries become great places where everything is fine very soon. It can sometimes take 10, 15 years for things to improve to a very good level. But a gradual improvement trajectory has been the story of economic crises in the past. And I don't see any specific reason why Sri Lanka is worse than these countries. In fact, some of these countries have had far worse crises than Sri Lanka. I don't see any specific reasons why Sri Lanka is going to suddenly buck the trend and be the one of the few countries that have ever had decades-long crisis. I don't think that's likely. There will be improvement to some extent. It won't be enough, in my opinion, but it won't be great. It will be enough to start lifting us out of this depth that we're in and move forward.
Just to add on to what Chayu said, he had earlier identified Sri Lanka as a twin deficit country. That's a country that has a current account deficit, meaning that we import more than we export, and where our government's budget is negative, where the government spends more than it earns. Currently, through presumably the staff level agreement, there are institutional reforms taking place that will help address both of these. The new Monetary Law Act will make the central bank significantly more independent and also limit the government's ability to spend more than it earns through a system of fiscal rules. So presumably an upgrading of the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act so it has some actual teeth. These two together can play a significant role in limiting the twin deficit problem. And in addition, we also need to remember that the global macroeconomic conditions that allowed Sri Lanka to borrow so liberally at global capital markets are no longer exist in the same way. Post the global financial crisis, there was a huge liquidity glut because of QE. Currently, global interest rates are rising. There was also a huge Chinese capital surplus that existed at that time. So over the next decade or so, it looks like the macroeconomic conditions are going to be quite different, and therefore Sri Lanka's ability to have sugar highs through expensive foreign currency debt are going to be considerably lower. So I think we're going to look at a much more sustainable growth model over the next 10 years. So just as much as economists were pessimistic on your show for the last 2 years, now they're beginning to get optimistic.
When you say a sustainable model, Daniel, what do you mean by a sustainable model? Because when you speak about these words, sustainability, all these seems to be buzzwords in the economic fray at the moment. When you say a sustainable model,
very simple.
What does it entail?
We export more than we import in terms of goods. Maybe we add services too. And secondly, that the government earns more than it spends.
Daniel, interestingly, I want to speak to you about the appropriation bill that was brought into Parliament several days ago. 613 billion rupees have been allocated for debt servicing for the Ministry of Finance. A huge number. How is the government going to find the funds for this?
So it's the same challenge we've been discussing throughout this show. It needs to increase tax revenue and also do the structural reforms required to accelerate growth. Because to reduce your debt to GDP ratio, you need to increase revenue, manage expenditure, and drive up growth, because then your GDP increases and the government's ability to, the size of the pie that it's taxing increases. So a lot of our conversation today has been on how do we increase revenue, how do we optimize expenditure, and then some of the structural stuff for growth. But I think in the conversation outside this room, the story of structural reforms for growth and the impact that has on debt sustainability has not been made as explicitly as it perhaps should be.
But bilateral loans and multilateral loans, ISB loans, we have to repay at least over 20 billion US dollars by the year 2026. How are we going to find this money with just 700 million US dollars from the IMF branch?
We can't. That's precisely why there's the restructuring negotiations taking place.
So would they agree to this? So would they agree to take a haircut? We know Tanzania, China took a haircut with regard to their debt. But in Sri Lanka, they've been so far silent. As I said before, on the 16th of October, President Ranil Wickremesinghe said that he spoke to the Minister of Finance in China, but several days later, he resigned from his portfolio. And this is going to have a major impact as far as the debt restructuring discussions with China moving forward.
So if we look at the history of sovereign defaults, it's clear that there will be some sort of haircut in net present value terms that will have to take place. In other words, creditors won't get the full dollar back of what they lent, if we include interest payments. The question is, how much pain do they take? And that negotiation is a very complex negotiation. So we have private creditors, we have public creditors in the form of other countries and multilateral agencies, we have creditors who are domestic, we have creditors, for example, the commercial banks, which hold ISBs as well. We have overseas creditors. We have creditors who have purchased debt through SLDBs, which are governed by Sri Lankan law. We have creditors who have purchased debt through the ISBs, which are governed under New York law. Then even within these particular bonds, there are different legal arrangements in terms of collective action clauses. So this means that there are many different stakeholders. These many different stakeholders have differing interests. And it's a very complex negotiation process that is currently underway with a huge amount of uncertainty. Therefore, I think making any comment on how long it's going to take, we can look at past precedents and say, okay, fine, maybe it'll be somewhere between, anywhere between, let's say, 12 months and 36 months. But it really depends on the nitty-gritties of these negotiations, the time in which they're taking place, their precedent-setting ability. So it's a highly volatile and uncertain situation we're facing with respect to debt restructuring negotiations.
I just got a message on my phone. I opened the flow for questions from our viewers as well on the number 0766 565353. Why not the president look into ways and means of bringing back billions of stolen money and assets of the public? Isn't that the shortest way of reviving our economy instead of taxing the already burdened public?
So it's extremely important to hold those who have stolen money, those who have been corrupt, to be held accountable. That is vital for the health of our republic, both in economic terms and political terms. However, we must be under no illusion that this money can be easily recovered, and even if it can be recovered, that it can be recovered, it certainly can't be recovered quickly. So therefore, I think it's a very important topic to discuss in terms of the long-term health of our republic, but certainly not a solution to our current economic crisis.
If you look at the overall situation right now, Chachayu, it's a pity that we are in this situation at the moment. Today I was talking to you prior to the show how individuals who are paying 18% tax now have to pay over 32%, 36% of tax. The cost of living has gone up significantly. You see institutes like the Chartered Institute of Personal Management submitting letters to the highest authority in Sri Lanka to consider this taxation because of the cost of living that has come into play. Isn't this an alarming situation?
So I think it is an alarming situation, the fact that we have to face these kinds of problems. But again, and here I would actually have a slightly different opinion to Daniel in terms of the speed of some of these alternative measures. I'm not necessarily convinced that, for example, the divestiture of state assets can happen as fast as required. I'm not necessarily convinced that retrenchment also can happen as fast as required and as cheaply as required. I think those are important points to do and important things to move on. I'm not necessarily convinced that they can happen, the 3-6 months timeline that we are currently in, that we really need to get some sort of revenue into our coffers in. So it is a pity. It is very much a terrible situation that we've come to here. I mean, if past decisions were not taken the way they did, past policy mistakes were not made to the extent that they were, we wouldn't have to take these massive steps. We would be able to take much more gradual steps over the period of time. But we can cry over spilt milk, and we should hold those accountable for those measures, I think, and make sure that we make better decisions on ourselves as well moving forward. But again, unless there are alternatives that can happen very fast to the extent that we need, it's either this pain or, in my view, worse pain. I think less pain is better than more pain, essentially, is the view that I'm taking here.
And talking about pain, Shai, the safety network that the government is very much focusing on, it was also stressed upon by the IMF and the World Bank, the ADB. So do you think we are doing the right things in terms of setting up a safety network for the most vulnerable communities in the country?
So do we need to set up a safety net for the most vulnerable? Very much. Are we doing it? So we are doing more over the last few months for social safety in Sri Lanka than I think we've done over the last 15, 20 years. So the extent of this crisis, the push that these multilateral agencies are putting onto Sri Lanka to force us to act on this is creating big change in the social safety space. Is it enough? Other amounts, for example, we've had plenty of problems with some of over the years. There's politicization issues, there's allocation issues, there's administrative issues. There's improvement on all these counts, I think. Is it enough to make enough of a difference to lift everyone out of poverty? Very much not. So improvements are being made. There are more people that are able to eat as a result of the social safety improvements that have happened. Does it mean everyone is able to eat to the extent that they need to? No. Improvements are being made, and as per my understanding, the push from the multilaterals is very much driving the speed at which these improvements are happening. For example, the setting up of the Welfare Benefits Board, there's digital digitization of the administration that's starting to roll finally. These things are improving the situation and starting to improve the situation. I think the question for a lot of these reforms, like a lot of the points that we talked about, it's not the current situation, because I think right now there's impetus to start on a lot of these things. And on the things that can be completed fast, they will get completed fast because you really need to move on it. The question is, after this immediate moment is past, will those be continued? Will we instead stick to the easy solutions? Will we instead stick to the ones that the government can just get by on? That is I think the question that is more of a problem. I think a lot of things start now. The question is whether they continue and whether they conclude to the extent that we require them to.
I think also one major lacuna in the social safety net that we have, actually Sri Lanka in some ways, compared to many other countries, has some resilience built in by the fact that most Sri Lankan households own some land. And we don't have a landless peasant population unlike in some countries. However, the poorest and most vulnerable community in this country, which is the plantation Tamil community, if you look at the rate of land ownership, it's about 30% compared to all the other communities in the country, which is between 70 and 80%. So if we want to talk about creating a social resilience and a social safety net, ensuring that that community's land owning also comes up to the level of other communities, I think is a critical measure for improving poverty and resilience in this time in particular.
And some would argue, yeah, we are talking about the human aspect, but some would argue saying that that is also a cost, an expenditure for the government. So how is it justified in terms of economy having this safety net? And also basically that is a cost that does go into basically making a safety net for vulnerable communities. So how is it justified in economic terms in times of a crisis?
So before Chayus, just one line answer to that. Here it doesn't cost the government anything. The government already owns huge amounts of land precisely where the plantation community are working. So it can transfer that land freehold, which will also improve agricultural productivity. So it's a win-win all around.
So, but generally in the safety net issue, like even the Samurdhi and also giving subsidies to these communities, it does take a hit on expenditure when it comes to the government. So some would ask the question like, not that we should get rid of it, but also if it is sustainable in the current situation.
So I think whenever I think about a cost, it's about what are there benefits to the cost in the short term and the long term. I think a lot of expenditure that we currently have in Sri Lanka doesn't tick both of those boxes. It might fit some short-term benefit to some individuals, or it might only have a long-term benefit, a huge cost in the short and medium term, right? So I'm generally biased towards things that have long-term benefit, because I think that long-term benefits over time pays for itself. But social welfare has short-term benefit. It literally keeps people alive. And in the medium to long term, it builds up the productive capacity of the economy. You're talking, I mean, we talked about the education system and the fact that there's a lot that's missing in the Sri Lankan education system. But it's also true that if not for the education system that we do have, I'm sure that our the system of the productivity that we've seen in the country would be even lower. If we didn't have this kind of healthcare system that we did have, there'll be far more people who are sicker. There'll be far more people who have, who essentially don't get to work as well. So I think there is a lot of productive capacity that comes from the social spending, and that is a medium to long-term benefit to the economy. There is a short-term benefit in a crisis to make sure that people survive and have food to eat and don't die of hunger. That's another question. So I think those two boxes are ticked for me in social welfare. Yes, it is a cost. And therefore, this reallocation question that we talked about, the revenue question that we talked about, also all do come into place. I think that is the kind of cost that is, to me, more of a non-negotiable cost, whereas a lot of the others, I think, very much reallocation is required.
Daniel, moving forward, you've advised the Ministry of Finance at one point in your life, and I don't know whether you were successful or not, but you did that role, you played that role in the capacity of the advisor to the Ministry of Finance. What are your thoughts on how the Ministry of Finance is acting now, and what is the way forward?
So I think the entire economic policy making apparatus within this country is operating within the framework of preparing for an IMF program. In order to get board approval, there will have to be prior actions that take place. Prior actions are complete X and Y and Z reform before the board approves it. Following which, for the release of every tranche under the, I don't know the number of reviews that will exist for this program, for every tranche of money that's released, there will have to be certain actions that are undertaken. So a significant part of the energy and efforts of all economic policy making institutions will be shaped within the framework of this program. In addition, outside the program as well, obviously the government will be taking measures to increase revenue, optimize expenditure, and drive growth. So I think there are a number of initiatives that are currently underway. The direction is no longer negative. We are no longer in a state which we were between 2004 and with a couple of exceptions, early 2022, where reform had stalled or reversed. Now we are again on a reform trajectory. So I think the question is, how fast can that reform take place? How wide can it be? How deep can it be? And how well can it be communicated? Those are the questions in my mind, but at least I think there's been a U-turn, and that U-turn is very welcome.
Shai, what about yourself? I know you've not had the privilege of serving any government portfolio as yet, but then again, what is the way forward to Sri Lanka?
So I would also agree with the bulk of what Daniel just said. We're in a better direction now, for sure. We are moving towards the policies that we need to take. The balance of that, we might have to, obviously everyone will have different opinions of it. Like we talked about earlier. An importer would say that, don't move away from the imports as fast, give us some more time to get used to it. An exporter might be more happy with the exchange rate depreciation than an importer. Someone who's primarily a consumer who has different priorities will argue for a different kind of breakdown of the system. But I think the direction that we're in broadly is good. The question for me is, how long can we sustain this? I think there are structural reasons to which, compared to the past, which makes a reversal harder. It is the fact that we are at such a fragile footing that we don't have the time to reverse. In the past, it would have been that, whenever we get closer to an election, you reverse, you run bad policy for a few years, and then only when you're forced to it, you start changing things again. I think things are so fragile right now, there's no space to wait 1 or 2, 3 years of bad policy. I think the moment you take bad policy now, that is harmful macroeconomic policy, things start going south immediately. Within months, I think you're back at a really bad place, because the footing we're on is so fragile. It is going to remain fragile for a significant amount of time, which is dangerous, of course, because we're all on this fragile footing. But I think that also forces us to keep moving down a better trajectory. And Daniel also talked earlier about the global factors also not being necessarily as conducive as it were in the last decade, for example, also very much true. So I think there are structural reasons to why we are unlikely to see as much of a reversal, as consistent of a reversal as we have seen in the past. Will this current pathway slow down? I think there's a significant chance of that. I'm not saying that's likely to happen, but I think there's a good enough chance that things will slow down the improvement trajectory. But I think we will gradually move on this path of improvement for long enough that we will, there will be bumps along the way, but we will come to a point, I feel, where things are better again and things are going to look better again. And the Sri Lankan economy structure will be maybe not fully to the extent that I might want it to have changed, but enough down that path for me to be happy about the change, even though it hasn't gone all the way.
So I want to come into the final round of the show tonight and ask the two of you a very simple question. We are right now in a very decisive juncture in the country's economy as well as the country's history. We are in a very critical point of time that we're discussing about. A few months from now, it's going to be the end of the year. A few years from now, 2025 is just going to be around the corner, and we won't be far away from that. And we are discussing about maybe Sri Lanka may go to another default. We saw the statement that was made by the governor of the central bank recently at a press conference saying that we have to take tough decisions. And Daniel, in your opening remarks, you spoke very eloquently about how important it is to have tough reforms being played out right now in the political sphere as we speak. What must the government do right now? What must the people do right now? What is the message you have for both these parties? The government to play its role and the people to stomach these roles. What is the message you have for them?
I think the message I have is we need to prioritize. What are the most important reforms that need to take place, and what are the reforms that can take place only now? In my view, state-owned enterprises have been something that have been holding Sri Lanka back for over 40 years. Privatizing state-owned enterprises will increase government revenue, it'll reduce government expenditure, it'll unlock growth, and it'll bring foreign investment. So that's an absolutely #1 priority. A second priority is to reduce the size of the government labor headcount, both in the military and civil domains. This will significantly reduce government expenditure, which will help reduce money printing, which will help reduce inflation. It'll also mean that there's productive labor available in the economy for productive activities, especially in the export sector as well. So these two reforms, which are fundamentally about the state, are absolutely critical in my mind. They're very hard. They're not difficult. They're difficult to do politically. They require the public to cooperate and understand that this short-term process is something that we have to go through in order to have a longer term, a chance in the longer term.
Chai?
I think the message to the government is don't just do and carry out policy, but communicate it well. It's not been something the government of Sri Lanka has shown itself across the years to be very capable of, but that is a critical part of a reform process. Communicating the requirement, communicating the reasons, communicating that the pain that the people are going to go through is going to be worth it for XYZ reasons, and this is how this whole pathway is going to go. So I think that communication is a critical part that the government must play, must prioritize in actually getting through. To the people, I think the broad message that I have is, yes, a lot of what we are talking about is, and I would say the vast majority of what we're talking about is up to do with government, but don't let that where the responsibility lies, the fact that the responsibility lies primarily with the government, absolve you of your own responsibility as well. So that's another part of the message I think is critical. Again, the onus will be on government, but individual citizens also have a part to play here, and that part does not need to be passive. It does not need to be, I don't like these tax reforms, but I will pay it. But it also must be pushing good policy to the government as well. It must be about looking at if for example, the question on the tax reforms being inequitable, how can we push more equitable tax reform? How can we push the government to move fast on tax measures that it has spent decades dallying on tax administration reform? So I think there is an active role for the citizenry to play in the reform process to go along with it, and not just a passive role. So for the citizenry, the message is to be active, the government to communicate.
Thank you very much, Daniel and Chayu, for your thoughts on Face the Nation tonight. Daniel Alfonsos is a former advisor to the Minister of Finance, as well as Chayu Damsingha is an economist. Thank you very much, Nisal, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation tonight. We were discussing on the ground of Budget 2023. It's going to be a tough year as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. On the 14th of November this year, a few weeks from now, we will hear President Ranil Wickremesinghe in his capacity as the Minister of Finance making the first reading of the budget to the 225 members and the general public. We'll have to wait and see what unfolds as far as the Sri Lankans are concerned. There is not going to be any magic wand. There won't be anything pulled out of a black hat either. We'll have to wait and see how things are going to unfold. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. Learn before you earn, take risks, and run for what you want the most. Take care and good night.
More integrated.
So I think there is no question.
They ought to have reversed it.
It's a bit of window dressing.
Forgotten about disasters that have been introduced. Now those are the same people who were laughing at.
Today's topic is of very high.
We have been importing more than we are exporting.
The tax measures in isolation and
a reflection of good governance.
An important word.
Newsline, weekdays at 8:30 p.m. on TV1.
රටට බත දෙන රජරට දිරිය මිනිසුන් වෙනුවෙන් අනුරාධපුර රඹා කැපූ වැව ගම්වැසියන්ගේ පවස නිවමින් ජලය මහවිලච්චය සාලියමාලා විදුහලට පරිගණක විද්‍යාගාරයක් සහය අවැසි තැන අහක නොබලා සවිය දෙන ගම්මැද්ද රට නගන ජනපවුර